Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the South-South Dialogue on Sustainability lecture series of 2022. It is co-organized by Global University for Sustainability, Lingnan University, and Asian Regional Exchange for New Alternatives, and Green Guan Ecotech Center in Beijing. My name is Xue Cui Jadi Margaret, a founding member of Global University for Sustainability. We provide English-Chinese simultaneous interpretation. You can choose any interpretation at the bottom of your computer screen. We would like to thank today's interpreters, Huang Xiaomei and Li Monghong. Apart from Zoom webinar, we are also doing live streaming at Bilibili, which is a very popular social media platform in China. On 8th of March, we start the first lecture series with African peoples of struggles for liberation. And we are most honored to have Dr. Philos Manji and Professor Yokoreka Somet. Today, we will have the third and fourth lecturers. Let me first introduce the co-moderator, Dr. Philos Manji. Dr. Philos Manji is the course director. He is a adjunct professor in the Institute of African Studies at Carleton University, Ottawa in Canada. He is also the director of Daraja Press, a publisher that nurtures reflections, shelters hopes, and inspires audacity. Now I pass the floor to Dr. Manji. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's once again a real pleasure to be with you and to thank you for welcoming us in such a warm way and helping us organize this course. Today, we have two speakers. One is Richard Pitthouse, who is a research associate at the Wits Institute for Social Economic Research at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. He's also, and very well known for, being the editor-in-chief of New Frame, an extraordinary newsletter that comes out regularly from South Africa, covering struggles both in Southern Africa and beyond. He's been writing for newspapers in South Africa and for more than 20 years, and he also runs the Commune, a radical bookshop in Johannesburg, which has very kindly been taking some of Daraja Press's books. Richard is going to be speaking on a wonderful pamphlet which I've shared with the organizers called Being Human After 1492. Richard and I go back a long way, and it's a real pleasure, Richard, to have you on board, and thank you for accepting to give this lecture. Our second speaker will be talking about African liberation and the Afro-Asian writers movement. Really important because I think it's so little known how the connection between Africa and China and the Global South was a really strong outcome of the Bandung process many years ago. I will introduce Tariq in more detail a little later on before he speaks. But for the moment, let me say, Richard, a warm welcome to the African people's struggle for liberation. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Feroz. It's lovely to see you, even if it's through a Zoom screen. And it's really good to be in touch with everyone else here. These are extraordinary times globally, and the extraordinary times right here. I've just made a 14 and a bit hour drive across the country. So I just arrived back in time for this. And on the road, my mind was occupied by the intersection of the extraordinary moment here in South Africa and the extraordinary moment globally. And I think there's something that ties them together. So the reason why I was in the rural village in the Eastern Cape province of South Africa, a very, very beautiful part of the country along the coastline over the weekend, is that last week on Tuesday, a young man, an extraordinary young man, who's been involved in organizing the poorest people in the country against great odds to occupy land and to build a commune, was assassinated. He was assassinated by local figures in the ruling party here. That was on Tuesday. On Friday, one of his comrades in a nearby settlement was murdered by the police. This is two deaths of two activists in the biggest popular movement in the country. And yet, there are not thousands of people taking to the streets. There's nothing like Black Lives Matter happening here. There's been a little bit of media coverage, but that's on the back of years and years of organizing by a large number of people. This movement, it's called Abahlali Basamjondolo, has been in existence for close to 17 years now. More or less, those deaths pass as something of no consequence in a country that calls itself a democracy. Now, at the same time, of course, there's the war in Ukraine. And I saw a figure that said that in one day, the Guardian newspaper, sort of liberal newspaper in London and England, had written more articles on that war than it had written on the war in Yemen, which is, of course, prosecuted by Saudi Arabia and backed by the United States, in a year. And in South Africa, where a lot of the online media is really controlled by white people these days, they've been speaking and writing all the time as if we are the West, as if the rule of the West is in everybody's interest, as if the West is virtue, if it's justice, as if it's democracy, and that we must all rally to defend the West and to oppose its enemies. And of course, the two enemies that are, I'm putting enemies in inverted commas, that we are told are the greatest threat to the West are Russia and China. We see this huge value placed on the lives of people who are victims of war in the Ukraine. We don't see that value placed on the lives of people who are victims of war in Yemen, the more than 1 million people who died as a result of the American invasion of Iraq, the 5.5 million people that have died in the wars in the Congo over a number of years. The value accorded to different lives is so radically different in the international sphere, but also here at home, where people essentially can be murdered by the state with something close to impunity. And to me, there's something that ties these two things together, these two moments, one local and one global. And that is the history of liberalism, Western liberalism, which we are told is the answer for those of us seeking a more just future. We're told that it's already there. All we must do is accept its authority. We're told that it guarantees the integrity, the dignity, the value placed in the lives of everybody. But it so plainly doesn't. The lives of someone in Palestine, a person in Palestine, do not count the same as the life of someone in Yemen. In a democracy in South Africa, more than a quarter of a century after apartheid, if you are poor and you are Black, your life still counts for nothing. And the essay that Feroz has circulated and for you to read was written really the day after Donald Trump was elected. And then I sort of, finessed it a bit the next day. I mean, of course, I didn't do that research in a day. It was based on things I've been teaching. But I was trying to understand, how is it that, at that point in history, Americans could vote for someone like Trump, someone who is so self-evidently unfit to hold any kind of public office. And to me, the only explanation for why they would vote for Trump, there were lots floating around, but the only real one was that Trump was telling the American electorate that he was defending their special place in the world as white people. He was telling them that he was going to stand against an incoming tide in history that would challenge that and say that every person should just count as a person, that there's nothing special about being a white person. It doesn't give you a particular claim on value or dignity or wealth or land or power. And I was very impressed with a book by an Italian historian, Domenico Losurdo, communist historian, called Liberalism, A Counter-History. And Losurdo shows in that book, he's not with us anymore, he died not that long ago, but in that book he shows exactly what we're just witnessing right now in South Africa and what we are witnessing globally, which is that liberalism has always taken the form of having an in principle affirmation of the rights of everyone, but in practice, very different politics. And for Losurdo, liberalism always postulates a kind of sacred space. It's geographic, but it's also racial. A sacred space in which rights are affirmed and confirmed. And outside of that is a profane space where people's lives don't have weight, where there's no respect for their autonomy, and so on and so on. So for Losurdo, that sacred space is initially geographic. It's Western Europe. It becomes racial. It becomes carried on the body when white people from Europe go to Australia or to the Americas or to Africa. They carry that sort of sacred value with them. They are people who cannot be killed with impunity. They are people who must be respected. And Losurdo points out that even liberalism's, most enthusiastic supporters will acknowledge that liberalism was not initially there for everyone. And they will say, well, it started with rights for some people, white men, middle class, elite white men in Western Europe, but it slowly expanded to include women, to include the working classes in Europe, and now to include people elsewhere in the world. And that we just need to be patient, and eventually liberalism will include all of us. But that justification for liberalism doesn't understand that it is fundamentally entangled with the rise of an idea of Western superiority, which at a certain point in history becomes racialized. Liberalism is not a sort of creeping enlightenment that will slowly include everyone. It still has its outside, it still has its other. If you're in the Yemen, your life does not matter today. If you are poor and black in South Africa, even though we are governed by an elected government that is largely black, your life still doesn't matter. You're still outside of that sacred circle of liberalism. What Losurdo doesn't do is tell us how we got there. And thinking about how we got there seemed to me to be really important if we wanted to understand the weight of what we were trying to deal with. So I was also influenced a lot by another thinker, Sylvia Wynter. She is still with us. She's not young anymore. She's a Jamaican theorist who was a dancer and a writer and did all kinds of really interesting things. And to me, she is arguably the truest inheritor of the kind of lineage of Caribbean thought that runs through Aimé Césaire, great poet from Martinique, political activist and writer as well. Frantz Fanon, who was at the school where Aimé Césaire was a teacher. Fanon, of course, political militant, writer, journalist, psychotherapist, born in Martinique in 1925, fought German fascism in Europe during the Second World War, moved to France where he studied to be a psychiatrist, then ended up in Algeria where he joined the struggle against French colonialism. Fanon, in his first book written as a student, which is about the lived experience of anti-Black racism in France, makes reference to a play, a famous play by William Shakespeare, which is something that a lot of Caribbean thinkers have come back to many, many times. It's really a sort of recurrent theme in Caribbean literature. So Shakespeare wrote this play in around 1610, 1611. And it's not set in any real part of the world, but it was written at the time when Europeans were first colonizing the Caribbean. And this play, in a way, is an allegory about that. In fact, Aimé Césaire, Fanon's teacher, set out to translate it. And he got so enraged when he was translating it, he ended up writing his own version of the story. And that was in 1968, I think, a sort of time of global youth upheaval. But in that play, there's a figure, a character, Prospero, who is prosperous and powerful and white. And there's a character called Caliban, who is not recognized as fully human. And there's this conflict between the two characters. So for a lot of Caribbean thinkers like Césaire and Fanon, the Tempest becomes this literary device to think about the moment when this colonial drama begins in the Caribbean, and the moment when what becomes race begins to be invented. And Sylvia Wynter picks up on that Caribbean history, and she thinks really deeply about it. And she comes to the conclusion that before 1492, when Christopher Columbus arrived in the Caribbean, the first European to arrive in the Caribbean, an Italian merchant, but sailing for Isabel and Ferdinand, who were the monarchs in what are now Spain and Portugal in the southern part of the Iberian Peninsula, in Spain, Portugal. When Columbus arrives there, suddenly there is, for the first time, a global history. There were empires in the past, but none of them reached right around the planet. There were always aspects of human life, of course, never as separate from each other as colonial ideology would like us to believe, but functioning largely separately. So, you know, there were big empires, Rome, China, you know, none of them enveloped the whole world in the way that Europe came to envelop the world after 1492. That's the decisive moment when things change. And it's a moment that we are still living under. The epoch that began in 1492 is not yet concluded. We still live under the planetary domination of Europe. That's not over. It's changing, it's being challenged, it's encountered many challenges, it's mutated in terms of how it sustains power, but it's not over. So if the Europeans could arrive in the Caribbean in 1492 and assume an absolute superiority over the people they encountered there, a superiority that would enable them to massacre the people they met there, to enslave them, to rob them. What was the basis for that sense of absolute superiority? Well, it's clear that in the beginning, it wasn't race as we came to know it later. It's clear that it was religion. It's a long story about how religion came to occupy that position. But if you go back to the Christian texts, you can see that the invention of the Christian religion, with Paul, the apostle, being the key figure who invents a new religion in what's now Turkey, there's an affirmation there of the universal. There's a famous line that Paul writes in what is called the Epistle to the Galatians. And he writes, "There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free man. There is neither male nor female." Now, what he's saying there and why it's so significant is that the message of this new religion is for every human. It doesn't matter whether you're man or woman or what culture you grew up in. It's an affirmation of the universal, something that Islam would continue later on. So the message of, for Paul, the resurrection of Jesus Christ is addressed to every human. So in one sense, it is universal. It's a universal message. But those who have not accepted that message are not counted as part of the elect. They're not counted as part of the faithful. So later on, after Europe has become Christianized, Christianity becomes something that starts to become entwined with European identity. Of course, it takes a long time for Europe to become Christian. Monotheism comes in at different times and different places, but the decisive moment when it becomes fully Christian is 1492. It's the same year in which Columbus arrives in the Bahamas. That's the year in which Spain, or what's now Spain, and parts of Portugal, drive out the Muslims who have occupied Southern Europe for hundreds of years, who have built a remarkable civilization, and one that is very inclusive, that includes Christians and Jews. They're driven out, the Muslims are driven out of Southern Europe, and they're driven across the Mediterranean to North Africa. The Jews are also driven out. They must either convert or leave. And suddenly European power becomes Christian. And going back to the Crusades, the battles between the monarchs in Europe, in the Middle East, with Islamic rivals, there's been a justification for war based on religion. So the Christian popes would do things during that period of the Crusades. We're talking 500 years before 1492, such as forgive all the crusaders who are going to fight wars in the Middle East for their sins in advance, or announce that there is the lands where the European soldiers, the crusaders who are going as Christians, are going, are empty lands. They're not occupied by anyone. Now, of course, when the Pope said that you're going into the empty lands, in Latin terra nullius, he wasn't unaware that there were people living there. What he was saying is that those people are not Christian. Therefore, they do not count as human. They do not have a right to hold that land. This was the justification for European power. And this is how European power was justified in the initial period of colonization in the Americas and in the Caribbean. That initial period of colonization was genocidal. There was mass enslavement and mass appropriation of wealth. The mining of silver in what's now Bolivia and also what's now Mexico became incredibly important for Europe to become rich and to be able to outcompete the Islamic forces on its eastern and southern boundaries. That wealth extracted with the most extraordinary brutality, people worked to death, is what made the modern world. This is a point that another great Caribbean thinker, C.L.R. James, who wrote a very famous book on the Haitian Revolution, and also a novel and literary criticism, made, which is that Euro-modernity and modernity for the whole world, in the sense that the world becomes entwined from 1492, is forged initially in the Caribbean. That's where this extraordinary wealth is generated. Of course, it's also Latin America. It's also those mines, the gold, and particularly the silver that was mined there. Modernity is seen as a triumph of reason, later of democracy, of the unleashment of human potential from its old feudal constraints. And of course, it did mean new forms of wealth, new forms of power, new forms of art. But if you look at how it was made, the destruction of peoples across the Americas, their enslavement, and the total denial of their humanity, it becomes clear that modernity needs to be seen as catastrophe for most of humanity. So when European powers arrive in the Caribbean and the Americas, indigenous people are destroyed, enslaved, but destroyed. Eventually, labor has to be sought from elsewhere, and labor is sought from Africa. The idea of slavery wasn't always a racialized one in the European imagination. I mean, the word slavery comes from the word Slav, a term to describe people in parts of Eastern Europe. The original slave markets were not racially determined in the way that we understand race now. They were largely determined by religion, by who could be enslaved and who could not be enslaved. When Africans began to be enslaved by the European powers and taken to what the Europeans called the New World, the justification for that initially was religion. But what happened, of course, is that oppressed people always make alliances. They always do. And in the English colony of Virginia, Jamestown was the capital. There were indentured workers from Ireland, dispossessed commoners who'd been made poor and had been taken as forced labor into the Americas, as well as enslaved Africans. But it's important to understand that when the first Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619, they wouldn't have seen themselves as Black, nor would they have been seen as Black. They would have been seen as Africans. The people who we would now consider to be white who were there would have been seen as English or as Irish, and so on. But racism, as we know it now, was invented there in Virginia, in the English colony. Some people even put a date to it. They would say that in 1676, when rebels, in today's terms, white and Black rebels, burnt down Jamestown, it suddenly became imperative for the colonists to divide the Irish from the Africans. And they started to do this by ascribing racial identities to people. So even if you were poor and you didn't have much power, but you were now considered white, you had more power and more standing than people who were considered to be black. This is a time when there's real changes in Europe. So the rule of the church in terms of knowledge, in terms of how we understand the world, gives way to science. So religion is giving way to science. In due course, feudal monarchies will give way to, not without many ups and downs, but will give way to democracy. But as religion ebbs as the key way of legitimating the colonial domination that Europe exercises over other parts of the world, it's replaced by this pseudoscience, this fabrication of race. So suddenly science, which is something that is real and is really developing new explanatory powers in the world, is misused to give justification to European domination. And that justification gives way from religion to race. Now, it's not just the scientists who are hallucinating this fabrication of race. It's also the philosophers. And the great philosophers, Immanuel Kant, David Hume, they're pretty much all involved in this. There's an interesting kind of debate about Spinoza, but we can perhaps go into that in questions if that's a good idea. But I want to talk about liberalism, because the first major liberal thinker is John Locke. He's English. He works for an aristocrat in England. And in 1689, he publishes a book called Two Treatises on Government. And it's an argument for what later becomes to be understood as the liberal democracies that we know today. But the thing about Locke, who, if you Google him, you'll see many people will say he's the founding father of the US, even though he wasn't American, because they think that Locke's ideas gave birth to the thinking behind the American state, behind its Bill of Rights and all of those ways in which it understands itself to be an emancipated and emancipating space. But if you look at Locke carefully, you'll see that, firstly, he invested his own money that he had in the slave trade. That's not a small thing. You will also see that he himself was directly involved in slavery and in colonialism. In fact, he was asked to help write the Constitution for North and South Carolina, obviously two English colonies, two English slave colonies. And when he did that work, he built into those constitutions the fact that, or the claim that, the fact that it's there, that African people will not have the same rights as white people. So from the beginning, liberalism was a philosophy of the elite that was entirely entwined with racial thinking. Now, some people who are liberals would say that's an aberration, that was an oversight in European liberalism, but that in time, there's a slow process of enlightenment, and people will get over that, and we just got to be patient. And if we're patient, liberalism will eventually come to include all of us. But the second great liberal thinker, John Stuart Mill, and he was more open to women's rights than John Locke. He's seen as, in some ways, he's seen as like a key thinker of modern liberal freedoms. When I used to teach at a university in the Eastern Cape, in fact, in the province where I just came from now, where the funeral was, but in a different part of it, a university named after a rapacious colonial maniac called Cecil John Rhodes. There was a textbook that was used for first-year politics students. The authors were all white. Every single person in that textbook is a white person. This is a textbook for South African students of politics. There's not a single African person in it prescribed as someone who should be read. There's no one from India or from China, or, you know, it's extraordinary. But there's a line in that textbook near the beginning that says, discussions about freedom begin with John Stuart Mill's essay on liberty. Now, Mill wrote that essay in 1859. It's still taught as a great text in the liberal tradition. But right up in the beginning, the very first page, he says he's talking about liberty, about freedom. And he goes on to elaborate a whole argument about liberty and freedom. But right up in the beginning, he says something incredibly important. He says, despotism is a legitimate mode of government in dealing with barbarians. I'm going to say that again. Despotism, in other words, a lack of democracy, total domination, is a legitimate mode of government in dealing with barbarians. So in other words, what he's saying is that democracy and freedom are not for everyone. They're for some people. And the people that they are for are quite clearly implicitly Western Europeans. If you were African or Indian or Irish or Southern European, if you were a Slav, you were a barbarian. So this idea of race, this entanglement of race with liberalism, is not just there in the beginning in Virginia. It's not just there in John Locke. It's there in John Stuart Mill in 1859. And, you know, it's there in the revolutions, the French Revolution and the American Revolution. The American Revolution has these ringing declarations of the rights of man, but those did not extend to indigenous people and to enslaved Africans. French Revolution, 1789, there's some ups and downs and debates around slavery, but by the end of the process, slavery is not overturned. Again, I mean, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, this grand ringing statements, this is the prose of kind of epoch-making declarations of a new and better world. But, you know, when people in Haiti organized a rebellion against slavery, Haiti being a French colony, and fought for their freedom for more than a decade, and finally won it in 1804, the states that had been forged through liberal revolutions like the French and the Americans didn't recognize this revolution. They didn't respond with comradeship or with welcoming the newly liberated country of Haiti into a family of democratic nations. They encircled that revolution from the beginning. They did what they are still doing today to a country like Cuba. They blockaded it. The French sent their warships. They forced the Haitians to pay back a debt, must be in inverted commas, a debt for the value of the slaves who had been lost to French slave owners. The successive Haitian governments had to pay that debt all the way until, I think it was 1947. So this drama of revolution, this celebration of revolution as the foundation for these modern democratic states that we see in France and in the US was never, ever extended to free African states in the Caribbean. It was treated as essentially as criminal. So an aspiration for freedom outside of that sacred circle of liberalism, if we go back to Lesotho, an aspiration for freedom that breaks with the logic of the epoch in global human history that begins in 1492, is treated as criminal. And that's not something that happened in the past. In 2004, the Americans organized a coup against Jean-Bertrand Aristide, an elected and wildly popular president of Haiti, who came to power through a mass movement known as, in Haitian Creole, as la valasse, as the flood or the avalanche, that came to power through a struggle waged at huge cost against two American-backed dictators, very, very violent dictators. And when Aristide made it clear that he wouldn't fully accept the authority of the West, they sent in the Marines and took him out of his house at gunpoint and removed him from power and from Haiti. So, 1804 to 2004, that's 200 years. It's 2 centuries of Haiti being denied its most basic forms of freedom, being denied any capacity, sorry, not capacity, but any right to participate in the most basic of liberal freedoms, to elect your own government. It concretizes really, really powerfully just how profoundly Western liberalism continues to mean, as it meant at its moment of origination, as it meant at its philosophical high points with John Stuart Mill, its moment of origination with John Locke, as it means today, that some people have rights, that some people are within that sacred circle, that their lives matter, that their dignity is inviolable, that it is not acceptable for them to be treated in certain ways, while other people outside of that circle continue to be expendable. So whether you are an activist in South Africa who lives outside of the now somewhat deracialized liberal space, but outside of it spatially, materially, or whether you are a person in the Congo or the Yemen or Palestine, you are not counted by that liberal order as fully human. And to see, as the dominant ideologies in the West and in the South African media today do, the West more broadly and liberalism more precisely as this emancipatory force which all of humanity needs to affirm and defend, is to see the world from the perspective of the people who have dominated it since 1492. It's not at all to see the world from the perspective of the majority, for whom Western power and liberal power has taken the form, in many cases, of a Holocaust, and if not for others, of it being a Holocaust, of it being utter social devastation. So that arc that takes you from European claim to have a unique claim on being fully human via religious language through to its secularization, the invention of the idea of race. That arc is still continuing. It hasn't collapsed. Now, of course, more enlightened opinion than Europe would say, well, you know, we don't believe in racism anymore. And of course, how racism works has changed, but they certainly believe in civilizational superiority. They may say that someone who speaks like them and studied where they studied and has a similar view of the world to them is equal to them. They may be quite happy. I mean, Boris Johnson, who's a very right-wing British prime minister, is quite happy to put people in his cabinet if they are right-wing elitists like him. But you know, if their parents or grandparents came from Asia, that's not a problem for him. But there's still fundamentally a sense of civilizational superiority and a claim to rule based on that civilizational sense of superiority. So I found it very useful to try and think about Trump, not just as an aberration, sort of moment of collective madness when 90 million Americans voted for Donald Trump, but to think about it as a logical expression of a deeply, deeply, deeply ingrained set of ideas and practices in the West amongst white people that's mediated through everything, through the philosophy they taught at university, through the Hollywood movies they watch, through the gossip they hear from their family members, that tells them that they have this special place in the world, that they count for more than other people. And that when that appears to be being challenged, whether it was by the election of Obama or by demographic changes in America, for those people, their common sense is such that, I don't mean common sense in the sense of something actually being sensible. I mean, in terms of how people unthinkingly make sense of the world, is such that Trump is standing up for what is true. I found looking at that history useful to understand Trump not as a kind of threat to Western liberalism that came in from the outside, not some kind of crazy populist who came out of nowhere and broke everything, but actually as a logical expression of it, almost an inevitable expression of it in the period when it begins to be challenged, whether it's demographic change in the US, the election of Obama, and of course, the rise of China globally, which is also a major challenge to Western power and a kind of existential threat to it at a certain kind of psychological level as well as a material level. I find that history very useful. I tried to lay it out in that little pamphlet that you have. I hope you found it useful. It's just, Trump being elected was one thing, but what's happening now, where South Africa, we still have this sacred circle. It's deracialized to a significant degree, but there's still people outside whose lives count for nothing, who can just be murdered with impunity and then slandered after they're murdered. And what's happening globally and the way in which the white-dominated media here are hysterically telling everyone that if you don't think that the West should rule and that it should rule forever, and that if you want to give any kind of context to the different value that's placed, say, on a white life in the Ukraine and a life in the Congo or in the Yemen, or then you are somehow being yourself barbarous. I think this issue of what actually is the character of Western liberalism is absolutely urgent, but it's one that is difficult to ventilate in many intellectual or media spaces because it's seen as perverse. And it's only seen as perverse because there's no recognition that Western liberalism has been so utterly catastrophic for most of humanity. I haven't repeated in detail the argument that's in the pamphlet. I'll just try to point to its key moments. 1492, Columbus's arrival in the Caribbean, the expulsion of the Jews and the Muslims from Southern Europe, the transition in the middle of the 17th century from, religion to pseudoscience, the fabrication of race as the justification for domination, the fact that liberal philosophy always carried that through with it, that when there were liberal revolutions in the US and then in France, they were not for everybody. In fact, in both cases, slavery got worse after the revolutions. It didn't get better. And the fact that the idea that there's maybe not the idea because it's always implicit, but the sense that there's a kind of sacred space of rights for some people and the rest of humanity is outside of that and doesn't have the same claim on rights, continues right into the present. The example of Haiti showing that concretely over a period of 2 centuries, and then bringing this away from the horror of Trump, which was what inspired me to write it, but into the horror of the present, whether it's in the neo-colony like South Africa, where 25 years after apartheid, we still have a neo-colonial society with colonial logic structuring much of it, or on the global scale, where it's the double standards between how the war, say, on Iraq, the US-led war on Iraq is reported, and this current Russian war against the Ukraine is reported are just utterly extraordinary, and yet it's almost like a thought crime to say that Western liberalism isn't something we should all be grateful for and accept and appreciate, and that it should be the sort of horizon of any kind of emancipatory possibility, that we shouldn't think beyond it. So I don't know if you have been able to read it yet or if you'll still read it, but I hope you find it useful. I found that history very, very useful.
Thank you, Richard. I think it's poignant how you pointed out how the killing of activists from Abakhali, Mandela, the shack dwellers movement in South Africa is seen by liberalism as being the killing of a disposable body, just as how Yemen is seen as disposable, but how Ukraine is treated is qualitatively different. I just want to pose a question to you. To what extent do you think that what everyone refers to as neoliberalism is, in a sense, the rebirth, not so much birth, but the expanded hegemony of what was liberalism, but under new circumstances?
That's a really important question, because neoliberalism, really was understood primarily in economic terms. It's like the sort of liberalization of everything in terms of economics. So you can't protect your economy. You must open your borders to imports from other parts of the world. You can't develop your own manufacturing capacity. Your oceans and your lakes and your forests must all be treated as commodities. People shouldn't form trade unions because that's going to interfere with the labor market. It's always been seen in those terms. But I think your question sort of intuits something deeper, because liberalism was the political power of Western Europe over the rest of the world. Neoliberalism says it's only about money now. You know, if we can make money, let's talk. And in a way, it sort of offered a route out of that kind of racialization at the level of ideology, because, you know, if you were a poor white person in Appalachia, no one wanted to talk to you. But if you were a rich person in Saudi Arabia with a lot of, you know, oil wealth, they wanted to engage you. But of course, what has happened with neoliberalism is that it hasn't become the total subordination of all forms of social life to the logic of the market. You know, that's a fantasy. It's a legitimating fantasy because it's always mediated through, you know, it's mediated through institutions, whether it's like the World Bank or the World Trade Organization. It's mediated through the UN to a smaller degree, but it's fundamentally mediated through American state power. You know, I mean, you know, when the US goes and removes a leader, like in Iraq, and then its companies take control of the oil wealth there, we're not dealing with this new world, the sort of world that people like Margaret Thatcher sort of promised, where everything is just about money and risk and, you know, there's like this sort of smooth space of financial flows. You know, it's not like that at all. It's still absolutely mediated through political power. But what it's done is, I suppose to some degree, it's given like the working class in the West less of a stake in the system. You know, they're not getting the kind of benefits of, you know, some social democracy, some sharing of the wealth that's generated. And it's given elites in the rest of the world some stake in the system too. And of course, as the working classes in countries like the United States or United Kingdom increasingly realize that they're not going to have the lives that their parents had anymore. They're not going to have the same access to work and healthcare and housing and so on. They are being very actively encouraged to, you know, to turn on the most vulnerable people in their societies and migrants. Mm. So it's kind of like, yeah, that hyper commodification, hyper financialization is leading to the opposite of this kind of smooth space where money just moves through these networks. It's xenophobia on the streets of towns in the north. It's wars in order to protect the power of the West. Yeah, it's Yemen being bombed without it being a crisis. Everything isn't subordinated to the market. The market is still mediated through Western states.
There's a question come up about, could you say something about class divisions in Africa, and how that plays into this idea of the sacred and the sacrifice zones?
You know, liberalism, Western power moved from, like I said, from religion. We can disregard your humanity because you're not a Christian, to the pseudoscience of race. We'll disregard it because you're not white, to now some kind of in-between thing where race is still highly relevant, but in some degree, class buys you out of race. So, you know, I think, and I mean, Feroz is a much better place to answer this question than me because of where he sat at the locus of all kinds of African networks. I mean, my perception is mostly shaped by my experiences and where I sit here in South Africa. But money buys you access to that sacred space. Maybe not fully, you know, race is not absent, but it buys you access. You know, I mean, in the most, you know, how you arrive at a place. Do you arrive in your own car or do you arrive in a taxi, or are you walking? If it's your own car, what kind of car? What clothes are you wearing? I mean, at the most sort of concrete level, all of these things mediate access to space. And I mean, forms of oppression always have to renew their legitimacy when they get to a point where they're under threat. And allowing elites from colonized countries in has renewed the legitimacy of political and economic systems that exclude the majority for quite a while. So in South Africa, we had this obviously brutally exclusionary system of racial capitalism that had no legitimacy amongst the majority of people. What happened after apartheid, we didn't change the structure of the system. It still depends on, migrant labor. It still reproduces inequality, impoverishment. Majority still gets some of the most appalling education in the world. What was done was that for 25 years, Black people were included in the system. A Black elite was manufactured by giving them access to the system, and that brought another 25 years or so. It re-legitimized the deeply illegitimate system, and one that was seen in those ways. But that's running out now. I mean, we have 75% youth unemployment in South Africa. That's, 3 out of 4 young people have never had a job and probably will never have a job. They don't care at this point who the boss is, that only takes you so far. So there was a period in which class suddenly didn't seem that fundamental to many people in South Africa. It seemed that the issue was much more about inclusion into the status quo, the dominant systems. Now, classes everywhere. I mean, so this young man who was assassinated, this activist, this key figure in building this commune in Durban, Ayanda Ngila, he was buried on Sunday, and one of the speeches given by a leader in the movement that he ended up giving his life for, he was speaking in isiXhosa, but I'll translate it into English for you. And he was referring to something that had actually been said by a retired constitutional court judge by the name of Zakia Kurb at a memorial earlier in the week in Durban, where, Zakia Kurb, the constitutional court judge, said, Ayanda, this young man, is dead, but he's now with people like Chris Hani and Griffith Mthenge and Victoria Mthenge. These are heroes of the struggle against apartheid. And then the judge, who's an old man now, I mean, he's retired, but he's a principled man. I mean, he's, one of, you don't see middle-class people in a shack settlement at a memorial. It's extremely, extremely rare. So he's there. And he says, but all of these people were killed by our white oppressors. Now we are killing our own people. And at the funeral on Sunday, Spuza Kore said that as well. He said, it's killed by the Black Boers, Amabunu, Amanyama, by the Black Boers. So class has returned with a real vengeance, not only as a lived experience, it was a mode of analysis, but also as a mode of politics. The Black Boer.
Well, this is really a big topic to discuss, and perhaps something that we'll take up in later panel discussions, because I do think the parallels between what has happened in South Africa and what happened in the rest of the neo-colonies, there are amazing parallels, and the understanding that the capacity to extract so much wealth from Africa is a function of labor still. and I think it's something that we will need to look into. But Richard, I would like to thank you very much for what is a really interesting talk, and sets a good background for us understanding how things have evolved, how the struggle for liberation has actually played into challenging the concepts of racist neoliberalism. As Lasota points out, they are conjoined twins. So thank you very much for joining us. Please stay on, because I think we have a really interesting talk coming up from Tariq Mehmood. I have great pleasure in introducing to you an old friend, comrade, and he and I go back to the 1970s in the struggle against racism in the UK. And Tariq was one of the people involved in the struggles of young Asian youth in Bradford, in north of England, and was arrested, charged with the crimes of terrorism at that stage, was imprisoned, and he and his colleagues fought a major struggle there. And Tariq defended everyone and got everyone released. He came to fame thereafter with a wonderful novel, which was published by Penguin, Hand on the Sun. And we are hoping here at Daraja Press to be publishing the next new edition of that book. Tariq is an associate professor at the American University in Beirut in Lebanon, where he's been working on research and archiving project. And he's also a novelist and a filmmaker. And together with Ken Loach and others, has produced some amazing films about racism in the UK. One of the things that Tariq has been focusing his attention, one of the many things that Tariq has been focusing attention on, has been this history of the that emerged from the Bandung conference in the 50s, led to the publication of an Afro-Asian magazine, which was based right across Asia and Africa, with some of the famous writers and thinkers and poets of that time in these publications. And there were divisions within this movement, as there were beyond that, with one part of the magazine being very strongly influenced by China, the other by other left forces in the Soviet Union. So Tariq is going to talk to us about African liberation and the Afro-Asian writers movement. So it's a great pleasure to have you here, Tariq. Welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Firoz, and thank you very much for the organizers for organizing this, and no less for all of you participating wherever you may be at the moment. And of course, the hardworking translators who I keep seeing switching between one and the other. Having done translation myself, I know how hard it is. And it's one important way for us all to share our experiences. Just before I begin, I hope everything goes well on technologically speaking, and I'm going to try and talk you through, and with lots of images. Just to correct a couple of things, I was indeed arrested for terrorism, and I defended myself, and of course, in the process, my colleagues, but we had thousands of people without whose contribution I would never have come out of jail. and we were acquitted in case some of your, which means we won our case, in case some of your viewers are wondering, what are we doing listening to this old man for? What I intend to do is really to pick up a few things from Richard's wonderful talk, when he starts that we live in amazing or extraordinary times. Perhaps all times have been extraordinary, but I grew up in England, as you know, and I've just returned to Beirut from where I'm talking to you. And I'd just like to share that there is, you know, others have pain other than that in Ukraine. We somehow, we don't matter anymore. The pain of Kashmir, the pain of Syria, the pain of Palestine, of Iraq, of God, how many places in Africa, of Latin America, of Afghanistan, it doesn't matter. There's only one pain. It's blue-eyed, blonde-haired, white, and it's European. And I'm so glad that Richard referred so beautifully to many of his historical origins. So I will talk you through some of those who wanted to create a better world. Now, the fact it doesn't get created for all of us doesn't matter, because we lived through very serious nightmares. So I'm going to talk to you about an historic movement that emerges out of the nightmare of colonialism. Perhaps I'll talk to you and look at some of the dreams. What did we understand by liberation? Two of the journals I'll talk about, one is called The Call, and the other will be called Lotus. And as this series is focused on Africa liberation, I'll endeavor to show you how amongst the Afro-Asian writers movement, Africa held a very special place, and there's reasons for why it held the special place. And I will conclude on that with some examples on poems. So firstly, I know amongst you, there must be some who are poets, some who are painters, some who are writers. So we can all imagine and we can all dream. For the beginning part of my talk, I'd like us to have a little journey into our imaginations and try. Richard has very nicely pointed out some of the historical origins of racism, but it doesn't exist for its own sake. And he is very right. When I went to England first in the 1960s and I met my African friends didn't know they were black. Neither did I know I was colored, or a Paki, as I was referred to on the streets, which is a swear word, a derogatory terms for anyone of Asia and Africa. I didn't know at the time that the people of Africa and Asia were divided into multitudes of negatives. Some of us were called yellow, others of us were called black, others of us are called red, some of us were called brown, and a multitude of other insults and denigrations with which we were confronted on a daily basis. Now, it didn't exist for itself. This is a phenomena that was an all-embracing ideology so that they could control us, our countries, our bodies, our resources, so that they could exploit everything, including our shadows, our human wealth, our material wealth, our cultural wealth, through this long process of colonization and slavery. And let's imagine that world. There's Europe at the top. Look at the world it directly colonized. And in that colonized world, they slaughtered us. It didn't matter what came in their ways. We have this huge, vast sea of humanity, which is occupied, which is colonized. Where necessary, the indigenous peoples of these lands, whether they be in Australia, in America, Canada, Africa, parts of Latin America, and indeed some in Europe, they're exterminated if they stood in the way. Other populations uprooted, wholesale, transported wherever they could be put to use. Now, this is an era that doesn't happen for a day, a week, a month, a year. It goes on for centuries. So let's live through that nightmare of centuries. In some places like India, we're not even allowed to have and own salt. Our waters are controlled. And all across this vast world of ours, the European powers not only stop us talking to each other, they even stop us talking to our neighbors, lest we say, you have no right to be in our lands. We are as human as you. You cannot steal from us, lest we say something as dangerous as that. Our tongues are silenced by the most brutal forces. And here, it really doesn't matter who the colonizers are. They're merciless in their own self. So what is it then that we do? We're not allowed to talk to each other. So when we come down to how the African and Afro-Asian writers movement is born, bear in mind that before its birth, we have an era that stretches into a long, long history. And this is from Afro-Asian writings. And I'll just start off with a little poem. And I want to imagine the pain and anger that's embedded in this pain. And then one day they landed on our shores, the sharks, and peace was gone. The songs, the dances, gone. They pounced upon our huts, the falcons, as if they did not have enough of oceans and air. They had to conquer our lands. Why? But why? They had the guns. They had the alcohol. All the lies and hate. The hate here is clearly seen in terms of how racism falls out. But there was resistance to this process throughout the colonial era, from China, from Southeast Asia, to every nook and cranny of the earth. If we had nothing to fight back with, we fought back with our poems. We maintained our stories to maintain our humanity. And one day, there's a culmination of many complex processes. The colonial era had to and was forced to come to an end. And in 1952, those countries, some of the flags that you can see there, 29 countries came together in 1955, at the Bandung Conference, where people wanted to regain, and one of the great agreements that they had was on the importance of culture. Now, I'm going to stop a little bit because my job isn't to discuss the Bandung Conference, but the Writers' Conference. Now, here, I'd like all of you to hold your breath because I'm going to try to play a link for you. So a few years after the first gathering of these newly independent countries, Afro-Asian writers, ignore my spelling at the top, Afro-Asian writers met in Tashkent. Here is an old film of that conference, clearly not here. So if I can play you that, here is an old film of that conference. This conference that takes place in Tashkent not only brings people together, but it's also heavily scrutinized by the intelligence services of the colonial powers of the time. And here, what you see in a note taken by at the conference I draw your attention to the Ifu Theodora, who described the conference as a step towards the unification of the disrupted soul of mankind. That what the Europeans had done to us had actually not only occupied and exploited our natural human wealth, but they had disrupted our indigenous development, and metaphorically speaking, she's saying disrupted the very soul of mankind. Let me quickly keep going forward. So the Tashkent conference takes place in 1958. It would lead to the birth of the first journal called The Call. This was produced from Beijing and from Colombo. It was in Arabic, English, and French. Simultaneously, once there is a Sino-Soviet split, there would be two journals, and I'll talk a little bit about those. One would start life off as Afro-Asian Writings in 1968 and would later become Lotus. Later on, after the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, its headquarters will move, and eventually it would come to an end in the 1990s, though a new one has been relaunched, but there's nothing like the previous ones. As I was digging through trying to understand this history, I came up with a series of reports held in the NATO archives of this conference. As you can see here, it is so heavily denigrated against Africans. It is racist through the core and plays into even the tropes of today. So I'll move on now. This is a much more detailed look at it. As I'm going to, you have the PowerPoint. You can refer to it later on, so I won't be reading through it. But in the main, what they are talking about is that on the one hand, they're saying it is not significant. On the other hand, they saw it as significant enough to keep the tally on who was who, what was what. One of the overriding processes, if those of you who are students of history, if you look at the amazing people's photos that you can see there, you will see many, a giant of the historical process of writers. And one of the common denominators between both wings of the Afro-Asian writers movement, that the pen has as important a role in the struggle as does the gun, the difference being that the Cole's overriding philosophy was that all power came from the barrel of the gun, whereas the Lotus and the pro-Soviet wing of the Afro-Asian writers movement would follow a line that would say that you can have peaceful coexistence with imperialism. At first, in 1960, now I have located a group of us have located almost all the copies of Lotus and all the copies bar one of the Call. It starts off as a bulletin, a few pages, but a few pages where are mostly declarations and calling for people to review the process. So I will leave this just as an example and come back to it in a minute. That the Call was significant is no short thing. The one in the center where you see, that is Chairman Mao signing his book of quotations for Senanayake, who was the General Secretary of the Afro-Asian Writers Bureau. He was from Sri Lanka. Next to it, the image, this book of quotations, this was discovered by some colleagues in Sri Lanka in the widow's house of the General Secretary of the Writers Movement. And it's the very same book, you see, Chairman Mao signing, and it is now part of an exhibition called Encounters, which is due to take place, sorry, according to this, in Sri Lanka. For those of you who get some time to visit, I will leave the details here, but not go much more into the exhibition and return back to my story of the writers' movement. So inside the main ideological positions of the call, they are guided by Mao's position that art exists for a specific purpose. It belongs to definitive classes, and also that there is a cultural battle to be held against imperialism, just as culture was appropriated by the colonial forces, then it has to be fought and used and so forth. Now, this is a view, similar views are held by both the movements. Now, let me go into some dreams. The dreams, of course, were that not only we kick the invaders out of the countries and lands that they had occupied, but kick them how? Cut them out. The idea was not that we simply replaced one set of thieves with another set of thieves, but that we built a better world. And how much of that world got built? Sadly, we heard earlier, and we can look around the world, many of those dreams are still nightmares. But let me go on. After the bulletin phase of the call would become a fully pledged a journal where people would study, it would publish poetry, it would publish short stories, it would publish articles, it would give reports of various wars across. And you can see very clearly that there is a dignity and a humanity given to people of Asia and Africa by the Afro-Asian writers, because these people are their people. It is not white man and white institutions looking down on us. There are many, many images, so I will share only a few. Armed struggle, of course, is taking place in Mozambique, in Angola. The struggle for South Africa against apartheid is not far from over. This is a little bit later, but the early parts of the Afro-Asian writers movement were preoccupied with Vietnam. Now, the call had at its center not only the liberation of Africa and Asia, and at the core of it was always the struggle against apartheid, in particular the solidarity with Palestine. So this was a special edition on Palestine that was produced, and these were some of these were amazing posters, which I would then see when I was growing up in England as well. Now, the other movement, now why does it split? It is actually a split, sadly, was initiated very clearly by a very famous Pakistani poet called Faiz Ahmed Faiz, who raised the money from the Soviet Union to launch a different movement against the Afro-Asian writers movement, which at that time was dominated by the Chinese support for the journal. So the very first journal, his name was Faiz Ahmed Faiz, who would go on to become an editor of Lotus, who I incidentally met shortly before his death. And as a poet, he is revered in India and Pakistan and rightly so, by tens of millions of people. Now, so here the very first movement for the new organization, which never acknowledged its predecessor, incidentally, the other one did. This new movement started life off, like, as you can see, like that, until it became Lotus. And the writers who were involved. So when you have time and you can go through this, I have just given you one set of numbers of who came to the Cairo conference, which was when the movement was united. The writers from these movements worked in both organizations, and these, just the list of names will tell you how many people from across the world were involved in this movement. So it was far bigger than the Tashkent conference alone. And just like the call, the other movement was fundamentally concerned what imperialism was doing, how it was destabilizing countries. And in fact, when I read through it today, it's like I'm looking at the world through their eyes, and it's as relevant today as it was then, because it's almost similar shenanigans. So very quickly again, some of the writers. Now, important to remember, both journals published writers and poetry from both, as you can see. Just some of the names I've included here. These are really giants of literature, and these are minor numbers. Now, minor number of names. So let's say, what were the fundamental issues that united them? I've mentioned what disunited them. I believe at their heart, almost all the writers were concerned about righting the historical wrong of imperialism. On the pro-Soviet wing is the orangey document. That's a resolution they passed on Palestine. And on the left, I think, yes, that is from the call, and you can see that we will forge weapons and no more of this injustice. So they are both committed to having a struggle that continues until we can kick out the colonial edifice above us. Now, so the very first poem published in what would become Lotus was the one, I think, that you're seeing on the side. And in it, there is a line called "In the Fog of Season's End." I think Alex Laguma would go on to name his novel by that line. So the main themes that are connecting the Afro-Asian writers, and they're not very different from today. There are anti-colonial wars, it is of racism, struggle against Zionism and apartheid, most importantly, Palestine, because whilst in some degree or other, we had some successes in the colonial struggle, Palestine still continues to be the Palestine continues still to be occupied. So one common denominator I came through when I was looking through these documents, we never saw an image of a united Asia, like you can see on the map. Certainly saw China, certainly saw India, and so on and so forth, but never united Asia. And here Africa and Africa's contribution was unique. And you can see it in the poetry of the call, as well as the poetry of Lotus, that it is Africa that will rise. Now, I am almost at the end of my talk, so let me now start concluding. Africa was seen as a unit amongst many writers, many poets, that in a sense, the liberation of Africa also means not simply kicking out the colonials who have divided it, but the unification of the continent by whatever means. Now, and also to getting rid of the centuries of abuse and denigration and dehumanizing thing. This was a poem that truly touched me, and I will end on this, and I will apologize to all of you for all the technological hiccups we've had. And I've just give you a summary of some of the lines that I particularly like, and it's called A Crown for Africa. I will twine for you a crown of soft beams of light, with the glowing Venus of trophies, and in the orbit of the feverish twinkle of the Milky Way, I will write in letters of fire, your name, O Africa. And perhaps we still have to write our names for our liberation in fire, for it's long way from actually stopping. Thank you very much for putting up with me, and I hope I didn't give the translators too much difficulty.
Well, thank you, Tariq, in spite of all the technical issues. I mean, I think there's a really interesting connection here with what Richard began with and what you've tried to convey. And you've posed some really interesting questions about, well, why is it that there was no Pan-Asian movement when there was or is a Pan-African movement? But I think what comes across in your talk is this incredible role of culture and poetry as the uniting force that spread beyond the African continent and changed the dynamics, which I think we've forgotten in nowadays. The deep connection between the way in which the world was challenged by Africans and Asians at the same time in that situation. So I want to really thank you for helping us grasp that. The big question does arise, why the split? I mean, you mentioned that it was raised by a particular person to make it separate, but what was the underlying politics that led to the split?
Yeah, thank you. Firstly, I think that there was intense rivalry between China and the Soviet Union, and that itself was very much based around the idea of whether you can have peaceful coexistence with imperialism or not. It's very much documented and also this was a point noted by the CIA in their archival documents, that the nowhere is the fight, to quote one of them, so intense that there was I heard a lot of music. It might have been from my the thing. I think the first point was that it was to do with the inner position, and that had been simmering almost from day one of the founding of the Afro-Asian writers movement. And I think that there was a lot of money put in as well by the Soviet Union. The writers in themselves, I'm not sure that necessarily they were bad. Just for your audience, at least 3 of them became presidents, and that doesn't, the leaders of their country. And of course, Mao Zedong and Ho Chi Minh were also poets and writers. So this movement was building itself on a lot of things. So in simple terms, I think that there was intense political rivalry. It was a very clear-cut move where I've read the letter now, which was used to fundraise for the breakaway movement. And of all places, the meeting took place here in Beirut in 1967, which led to the birth of the second wing of the writers' movement.
Okay, just to pose a question here. Why do you think this is from one of the members of the audience, why do you think that there's not one map of Asia that's sort of different from Africa? I mean, are there still interactions among African writers now? And what are the potentials for the rebirth of an Afro-Asian connection?
The fact that we're all talking together is very clearly an indicative that the birth of the Afro-Asian movement and the birth of the linkages between Africa and Asia are now unstoppable. The era that I was referring to, there was no internet, there were no journals, perhaps not even newspapers in the earlier days, which were not colonial controlled. So I think that people were always talking, like Richard said. It wasn't that we weren't communicating with each other, but the communication of resistance was fundamentally difficult. So it's a very good question. And I think that the people, I can't speak for people in Africa or Asia, but in simple terms, I don't think I didn't grow up feeling I'm Asian. I grew up, I'm a Kashmiri and a Pakistani. The idea in a sort of a popular culture wasn't there. Where I think when I spent a lot of time with my African friends, we always had some degree of an African sort of a social or political identity, which I don't think really exists in Asia. Now, why? There are lots of complicated reasons for that. And I think no short would be the contribution of the Pan-African movement as well within this process, that we don't really have a Pan-Asian sort of a thing. But if anything, the Afro-Asian writers, that is exactly what they were doing, but not in the maps and things. I was just trying to show a difference, but the commonality perhaps is far more important, that they were united on that which can unite them and not necessarily looking at that which could divide them. Therefore, whichever helps us to bring some degree of unity, I think it's a step forward.
Okay, we have a question for both yourself and Richard. Richard, are you able to join us on video? Let me pose the question in case I can pose. First of all, to Richard, why are most countries of Africa, why have they failed to achieve a land revolution in your mind? And then I'll come to another question that's coming up in a moment. Richard.
Yeah, well, let's just go for a simple question here. I mean, I would think it's different in different places. In South Africa, the failure to reallocate land on a just basis has, I suppose, two key forces that have not been confronted or responsible for that. One is that, and this is a minority of the forces at play, is traditional authority was opposed mostly by the ANC and by other actors during the liberation struggle. But across the African continent, forms of political authority that pre-existed colonialism were captured by colonialism, had their democratic elements hollowed out, and were turned into more authoritarian forms in a process that is sometimes referred to as decentralized despotism. So liberation movements often opposed those forms of authority, but more or less immediately after being unbanned, the ANC made its deals with traditional authority. So they still control the land that they controlled under the colonial period, and their power was never broken. But the bulk of the problem is, but the vast bulk of the problem is the land that is still owned by white commercial farmers, and the ANC just wasn't willing to take them on. There hadn't been a really well-organized rural movement in this country. The movements by the 1970s and 1980s were mostly urban, community-based or trade union-based. And there wasn't really a movement to contest that compromise that the ANC made. So we still have a situation where the vast bulk of rural land is owned by white commercial farmers. The land struggles that are happening now, where there's intense conflict between ordinary people in the state, are in the cities, where people are looking for urban land so that they can have a foothold in the cities where they can access work, education, healthcare, all of these kinds of things. There's two primary problems there. One is that urban land, well, the allocation of land is mediated either by the state, who do it for their own reasons, including patronage, and by capital, who do it on the basis of who can pay. So again, the ANC has not been willing to confront capital there, or white farmers, or traditional authority, and their own people have a big invested interest in how urban land is allocated as well. I mean, I think elsewhere in the continent, it's I can see Feroza's, it's different in different places, but ultimately it's a lack of political will and a lack of political organization to force states to address the land question.
Right. Well, we'll be talking about the agrarian question in subsequent lectures, but I just thought I would point people's just let people know about this particular book, which was by somebody well known in China, Samir Amin, who wrote about the agrarian question beyond neoliberalism. I can send people a link to where people can download that particular book, which is, I think, important to read. There's a question now for both of you, Tariq and Richard. What's the basis for Pan-Africanism today, given the diversity of African cultures, and how would Pan-Africanism be possible? What would constitute the base for Pan-Africanism? And perhaps in answering that also, Tariq, you might also make some recommendations, or both of you might make recommendations about African writers. People have mostly only heard of the ones who got the Nobel Literature Prize. So
I think, Firoz, I think you'd probably be the best person to answer the first part of the question. Regarding the second part, you know, there's such a vast list of literary giants. I would be embarrassed at not mentioning the appropriate names. But what I did put in one of the Cairo meeting screenshots, you can go and take your pick from there. These are giants whose influence, we will know the significance of their contribution in about 200 years to come. But I would be embarrassed to leave things out. I mean, I myself love poets like Kuneni. I can't read enough of them, you know, and many other writers. But I will leave it just on that one. I pass and defer to you.
Richard, over to you.
Well, I mean, I suppose the basis for Pan-Africanism from the beginning wasn't necessarily cultural homogeneity. It was the experience of being placed in a similar position in the colonial order. It was a political identity and a political project. And I don't think that spirit is extinguished. It's very different when you talk about states and you talk about popular movements and so on. But, you know, this funeral I've just come back from, you know, there were people there from organizations in Zambia. There was the president of the pro-democracy movement in Swaziland, where they're fighting basically a monarchy that is a dictatorship. These are political alliances. And I think a shared set of political experiences and at least some points of contact in terms of political commitment and a vision for the future are what bring people together. In terms of African writers, I mean, Tariq makes a very good point. Like, where do we start? Anyway, how do we know? Because it takes 200 years to be sure who's a truly, truly great writer. I'm looking over my shoulder at my shelf. You can't see it in the picture. Yeah, Feroz is the publisher, so maybe Tariq is right to defer to Feroz. But I mean, you know, I still think that in a way, a lot of sort of post-colonial political theory in Africa is kind of footnotes to Fanon. I would still really think reading Frantz Fanon is exceptionally important. It's the 50th anniversary this year of the publication of Walter Rodney's great book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. I think that's definitely an important text. You know, in terms of I mean, Ayikwama as a novelist doesn't get as much attention as someone like Chinua Achebe, but I think there's real depth and weight and value in his work. Zimbabwe's just got like a huge wealth of novelists. I mean, there's so many great novelists in Zimbabwe. Yeah, I mean, and there's all these new young writers coming through as well. I mean, you know, it's not just the sort of giants of that generation of the 60s and 70s. There's a writer from South Africa who has a small cult following, but isn't really recognized in the way that he should, whose name is K. Sello Dyker. He writes it's a very different kind of novel to the sort of heyday of African literature as it's remembered in the West. They're younger writers like, there's a guy from Nigeria called Chris Abani who wrote a novel about a shack settlement in Lagos that speaks to the present in quite powerful ways. But yeah, I mean, I think Tariq and I agree you can refer to Feroz, given that he's the publisher.
Well, I mean, the same problem. Why choose one and why not the other? But I think on the issue of Pan-Africanism, I mean, the inspiration for Pan-Africanism actually originated outside of Africa. It was amongst the descendants of slaves, and especially in the Caribbean, that movement really built up and became a real force only after the Second World War, with the Pan-African Congress and the formation of a strong anti-imperialist movement. Unfortunately, that transferred into a cabal of states, leaders of states, the Organization of African Unity and now the African Union, which is a Pan-Africanism of sort at the level of the leaders and some of the dictators involved in that. But what is emerging today is something more, I think, much more important, is the beginning of connections between grassroots movements on the ground and recognizing the commonality of the struggles that they have. And I think that's the new Pan-Africanism that I hope will emerge, with connections between, for example, the social justice movements in the ghettos of Nairobi and the struggles of Abahlali, Basmajondolo, and others. And so I think we are living in a period of a new emergence of a form of Pan-Africanism. It's now 11 p.m. in Beijing, and we only have 2,020 viewers. I'm sorry that they're such a small number, but there we are. I'd like to express, serious, very, very much thanks to both of you, Richard, for taking time off, especially as you had to travel such a long way to make sure you could get to do this with us. And Tariq, also, thank you for opening our eyes into particular dimensions of our history that we often don't know, and which are not, like all history, are more about the present and future than they are about the past. So I would like to express thanks on behalf of everyone here.